I'd worked horses for Reuben Avery 11 years, and in all that time I never once saw the man beg. So when he handed me a square of paper that cold September morning and told me to nail it up at the Mercantile down in Dovetail, I read it twice before I understood what I was holding. Wanted, it said in his hard square hand. A woman to keep house and cook, room and a fair wage, a sober widow preferred. Inquire of R. Avery, Antelope Mesa. I stood there in the bite of the wind with the paper snapping at my fingers, and I looked at him a good while. Reuben Avery had buried his wife 2 winters back and shut the door on the living world the same day they put Ruth in the ground. He'd let the house go to dust and cold ash. He'd let his own self go gray and silent. And now here he was, asking the world to send somebody back up the mesa to him. "You sure about this?" I said. It wasn't a question, not the way I said it. "Nail it up, Jonah," was all he gave me, and he turned and walked back toward the corrals with that stiff hitch he'd carried since the winter that took her. So I nailed it up, and I'll tell you, I rode home that day thinking nothing would come of it. A widower's posting tacked to a board in a town the size of Dovetail draws the curious and the cruel in about equal measure, and not much else. I figured we'd get a week of talk at the feed store, and then the whole thing would blow off the mesa like everything else did. I was wrong about that, the way I was wrong about most everything to do with Reuben Avery and the woman who came up our road. She came 9 days later, on the back of a freight wagon that wouldn't go the last 2 miles up the grade. So the teamster set her down at the foot of the mesa road and left her there with a trunk, a carpetbag, and a boy. I was bringing a string of green colts down off the high pasture when I saw the 3 of them, the trunk, the bag, and the boy. And then I saw it was 2 of them, a woman and a child, standing in the road like they'd been planted there. She was tall and plain dressed in gray, with her chin up and her boy's hand in hers, and she was looking up that long climb to the house as if she were measuring it. The boy was maybe 9, thin as a fence rail, with his mother's still gray eyes and a cap too big for him pulled down hard against the wind. "You'd be Mr. Avery's man," she said when I rode close. "Not afraid, just plain." "Jonah Teal," I said, "foreman such as it is, you'd be answering the posting." "Lena Brower," she said, "and this is Will's." The boy didn't say anything, only watched me with those flat, careful eyes that children get when life has knocked the easiness out of them too soon. The man at the store said the ranch was up the mesa. He didn't say it was the top of the world. "It's close enough to it." I got down and hefted her trunk onto the colt I was leading, and it near went over from the weight, so I knew there was a life's worth of something in it. "Mr. Avery know you're coming today." "He knows I'm coming. He sent the wage for the stage as far as Dovetail." She set her hand on her boy's shoulder. "He doesn't know it's the 2 of us." I looked at the boy. The boy looked at me. And I thought, well, here's the first piece of trouble, and we hadn't even got up the hill. We walked it, the 3 of us, with me leading the colts and her carrying the carpetbag, and the boy carrying nothing but managing to look like he carried plenty. It's a hard 2 miles up that grade, all switchbacks and shale, with the wind off the Calico Hills cutting straight through whatever you've got on. She never once complained, and she never once let go of that boy's hand on the steep stretches. And by the time we came up onto the flat of the mesa, where the house and the corrals and the long horse barns sat hunched against the sky, her face was raw with cold and set like stone, and she was still walking like she meant to get somewhere. Reuben came out of the barn when he heard the colts. He stopped dead when he saw her. And then he saw the boy. I was watching him. I'd gotten in the habit of watching Reuben Avery for the small things, because the big things he kept shut up tight, and a man learns to read his weather off the small things, or he doesn't read it at all. I saw his face go from nothing to surprise to a hard closed something, and I knew what was coming, because I'd known Reuben a long time and grief had made him careful, and careful had made him cold. "I posted for a housekeeper," he said, "not a family." "You posted for a woman to cook and keep," Lena Brower said. Her voice didn't shake. I'll cook and keep better than any woman you'd find without one. The boy's no trouble and he works. He'll earn his keep and mine besides if you'll let him. I'll not be raising another man's child. I'm not asking you to raise him. I'm asking you to feed him while I earn the food. She stood there in the wind with her chin up and the cold making her eyes water, though she'd have died before she let it be tears. I came a long way on the strength of your posting, Mr. Avery. I've got $9 and a trunk and nowhere behind me. If you'll send me back down that hill, I'd be obliged if you'd say it now, before I let the boy get warm and start to hope. It got quiet. The wind moved across the mesa and rattled the loose tin on the barn the way it always did. Reuben looked at her, and he looked at the boy, and I watched him do the arithmetic of his own hard heart. And here's the thing I'll remember to my last day. The boy, Wills, took a step out from behind his mother. He looked up at Reuben Avery, at the gray, silent giant of a man who just said he'd not raise him, and he said, in a thin, clear voice, "I can muck stalls, mister. I can carry water and split kindling, and I don't eat much." Reuben Avery looked down at that thin boy offering up his whole small self for a roof, and something went across his face that I hadn't seen on it in 2 years. It was there and gone, quick as a bird's shadow. But I saw it. "Barn's full of stalls," he said finally, rough as a rasp. "You'll find a fork inside the door." And he turned and walked back into the barn and left us standing there. That was how Lena Brower and her boy came to the Avery place on Antelope Mesa. Not rescued, not begged for. She walked up that hill on her own 2 feet and stood her ground and earned her stay before she'd been there 10 minutes, and don't let anybody tell it different. I was there. The house had been dying since Ruth died. I don't say that to be cruel about a grieving man. I say it because it was the plain truth, and because you can't understand what Lena Brower did unless you understand what she walked into. Reuben had shut up the front rooms entirely. He lived in the kitchen and slept in a back room and let the rest of it go cold and dark, the way you'd close off a wound and let it scar over rather than tend it. There was dust on Ruth's good chairs an inch thick. There were her things still where she'd left them, her sewing basket, her Sunday bonnet on its peg, a row of put-up jars she'd never opened, and Reuben had walked past all of it every day for 2 winters and touched none of it and let none of it be touched. Lena stood in the middle of that cold, dead house her first evening with a lamp in her hand, and looked at it a long time. I'd come up to see where they settled, and I watched her take its measure the way she'd taken the measure of the Mesa Road. "That's his wife's," she said. It wasn't a question. She had her hand near the bonnet on the peg but not touching it. "Ruth," I said, "2 winters back. The fever took her in 3 days. There wasn't any children." I don't know why I told her all of it. Maybe because she told me hers plain on the road up between switchbacks that Tom Brower had been a good man and a poor one, that he'd died under a turned wagon 2 summers gone, that the bank had taken the farm for a lien she hadn't even known he'd signed, that she'd cooked in a boarding house in Cedar Junction for a year till the place sold out from under her too. She'd told it the way she did everything, plain and without asking for a thing. 2 winters, Lena said softly, looking at all that grief turned to dust, and he's been living in the ash of it ever since. He's a hard man, Mrs. Brower. I won't pretend otherwise, but he's a fair one and there's no meanness in him. The hardness is just, I didn't have the word. It's just the door he shut so the rest of it wouldn't get out, she said. I know the kind. And she set her lamp down and took off her good gray coat and rolled her sleeves, the very first night, and she started to clean. She did it right, is the thing. She didn't throw out Ruth's chairs or pack away Ruth's bonnet or strip the dead woman out of the house like she was clearing ground. She cleaned around the grief instead of over it. She dusted Ruth's good chairs and set them straight and left them be. She took down the Sunday bonnet, brushed it soft, and hung it back on its own peg where Ruth had put it. The put-up jars she carried down to the cellar and shelved careful, in order, the way a woman who'd done her own canning would want them kept. She opened the front rooms and let the light back into them and built the fires up and made the cold, dead house warm again. but she made it Ruth's house warm again, not her own, and I don't think Reuben ever knew how much that mattered until a good while later, and I'm not sure he ever found the words to say it even then. The boy worked. Lord, that boy worked. Reuben had told him to find a fork, and Wills found it, and he mucked stalls that first evening till past dark, doing it wrong and slow and not stopping, and the next morning he was out before light doing it again. I taught him the right of it over the next weeks, how to fork clean without wasting bedding, how to gentle a nervous colt with the back of your hand, how to read a horse's ear and know its mind. He took to it the way a thirsty thing takes to water. He'd never been near a horse in his life, raised on a dirt farm, but he had the gift in him somewhere, the soft hands and the quiet, and the horses knew it before I did. And Reuben watched him. He never said a word about it, but I caught him at it, standing in the barn aisle in the cold with his arms folded, watching that thin boy work a colt on the lead, watching him not quit. There was a horse on the place, a blood bay gelding named Sutter that Reuben had raised from a foal, and that nobody could do a thing with since Ruth died, on account of Ruth was the one used to feed him, and the horse had gone sour and dangerous in his mourning the same as the man had. And one cold morning I came into the barn, and there was the boy, Wills, standing at Sutter's stall with his hand flat through the bars, feeding the sour bay gelding a heel of bread, talking to him low. And there was Reuben behind him in the dark of the aisle, watching, with a look on his face like a man watching the sun come up after a long bad night. He didn't know I'd seen him. He cleared his throat hard and said, "Boy, that horse'll take your fingers off." But there wasn't any bite in it. "He won't," Will said, not turning around. "He's just sad, mister, he's not mean." And Reuben Avery stood there in the dark and didn't have one word to say to that. The talk started in town about the way I figured it would. A widower with a widow keeping his house, and her not but 30-some and him barely 40, alone up on a mesa with a boy, that's meat enough to keep a town like Dovetail chewing all winter. The first time Lena went down to the mercantile for goods, riding behind me on the wagon, I saw it on the faces in the street. The Tilly woman who ran the dressmakers and her crowd gathered at the post office window to watch Lena Brower go by, and I heard the word they used, and I won't repeat it, because it wasn't true and it wasn't kind, and Lena heard it too and never broke stride. She bought her goods. She paid from her own tin. She kept a tin of her own wage and never once mixed it with the house money, never once took a thing from Reuben that wasn't her honest pay, and that mattered too, more than the town ever bothered to understand. And when the Tilly woman said something to her direct, sweet and poisoned, about the arrangement up on the mesa, Lena set down her parcels and looked her square. "My boy and I have a roof and honest work," she said, "and I earn every cent of my wage and not a cent more, and what you think of it, ma'am, is no concern of mine and no business of God's." And she picked her parcels back up and walked out to the wagon with her chin up, the way she did, and never said another word about it the whole ride home. But I saw, when she thought I wasn't looking, that her hands shook a little on the parcels. She wasn't made of stone. She just knew how to stand like she was when she had to. I told Reuben about it that night. I don't know if I should have, but it didn't seem right, the woman taking that for working honest in his house, and him not knowing. He listened to me with his face shut up the way it did, and when I was done he didn't say anything for a long while. Then he got up and went out to the barn, and I heard him in there a long time, working a horse in the cold dark, the way he did with the things he couldn't say. The next Sunday he hitched the wagon himself and drove the both of them, Lena and the boy, all the way down to the church in Dovetail. He hadn't set foot in that church since Ruth's funeral. He sat in the back pew between the widow and her boy, in his good coat, with his hat on his knee and his jaw set like a man facing a firing line, and he sat there through the whole service and let the whole town look at him doing it. And when it was over, he walked Lena Brower down the aisle and out the front door past the Tilly woman and her crowd, with her on his arm and the boy on his other side, plain as a brand, and he handed her up into the wagon like she was made of china, and he drove them home up the mesa without one word the whole way. He never said a thing to her about it. He never said he'd done it for her. But he'd done it for her, and she knew it, and I knew it, and I think half of Dovetail knew it too, and the talk dropped off to a mutter after that and mostly died. That was Reuben's way. He couldn't say the thing, but he'd do it. He'd drive 11 cold miles and sit in a church full of grief to say a thing he couldn't get his mouth around. And I started to understand, along about then, watching him hand her up into that wagon, that the man was a long way down a road he hadn't admitted to himself he was on. You want to know when I knew? I'll tell you when I knew. It was the killing frost, the first hard one, that came in late October and turned the mesa to iron overnight. We'd been bringing the brood mares down off the high pasture for a week against it, and we got the last of them down the evening before it hit, and we were all of us bone-tired and frozen through. And we came into the kitchen, Reuben and the boy and me, and Lena had supper on, a thick elk stew and biscuits and coffee black enough to float a shoe, and the lamps lit, and the stove roaring, and the whole house warm and golden and smelling of bread. And Reuben Avery stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at it. He looked at his house warm and full and lit. He looked at the boy pulling off his frozen boots by the stove and the supper on the table, and the woman standing at the range with a dish towel over her shoulder, and a strand of hair come loose across her cheek, turning to tell us to wash up before we tracked the whole mesa in. He looked at all of it like a man who's been lost in the cold a long time and has just walked up on a lit window and can't yet believe it's real and meant for him. And his eyes, I don't know how to say it any plainer than I'm going to say it. His hard gray eyes that had been dead as ash for 2 winters took the light off that warm kitchen and they beamed. They came alive. Whatever had been shut up behind that door in him cracked it open and it looked out at her, and his whole hard weathered face went soft and young and grieving and glad all at once, just for a second, just till he caught it and shut it down. But I saw it. I'd been watching Reuben Avery for the small things 11 years, and I saw the biggest small thing of my life cross that man's face in his own kitchen doorway. And I knew right then, before he knew it, before she knew it, before there was a single word said, exactly how it was going to go. The man's eyes beamed when he looked at her, and a man's eyes don't lie, whatever his mouth won't say. He caught me watching him. He scowled and shoved past me to the wash basin and said something gruff about the cold. But it was too late. I'd seen the door come open, and you can shut a door, but you can't make a man forget he's seen the light through it. It was a hard winter. I'll not pretend it wasn't, because the hardness is part of the story and you can't have the one without the other. The note came due. There was a note on the ranch. Reuben had borrowed against the place the spring before Ruth died to buy that Blood Bay stud line he'd built his whole hope on, and the note was held by the bank down in Dovetail, and a hard early winter that froze the grass off meant feed bought instead of grown, and the math of it was the kind of math that takes a ranch. A man named Hask held the paper, the banker, not a wicked man, just a money one, and he came up the mesa in November in a buggy with a robe over his knees to tell Reuben plain that the spring payment would have to be met, or the place would have to be talked about. I expected Reuben to send him down the hill with a flea in his ear. That was the old Reuben. But what he did was, he stood out in the cold and talked to the man reasonable and made a plan and shook his hand. And when Hask had gone, Reuben stood looking down the mesa road a long while. And then he came in, and that night after the boy was asleep I heard him and Lena talking low at the kitchen table over the ledger, her doing the figures. Because it turned out she had a head for figures her dead husband never had, and the two of them working it out together. What could be sold and what held, and what the spring colts might bring. A man doesn't sit down at a ledger with a woman to work out the saving of his life's whole hope if she's just the help. I knew it and she knew it. The only one who wouldn't say it was Reuben. Then the storm came. It came the second week of December, the kind of storm that gets into the old-timers' stories. 3 days of white wind with no top and no bottom to it, snow driving sideways till you couldn't see the barn from the house. We'd got most of the stock into the lower draws in the barns ahead of it, but on the second night, in the worst of it, the brood mares broke a rail in the far corral and got out into the storm, and the blood-bay gelding Sutter went with them. That sour, grieving horse the boy had been gentling all fall, and out there in that white roaring dark was the whole future of the Avery place, the breeding stock, the thing the note was borrowed against, walking off blind into the blizzard to die. Reuben went out after them. Of course he did. I went with him. We strung a rope from the house to the barn, and from the barn out toward the corrals, and we went out into it with lanterns that the wind near tore from our hands, and we found the broke rail, and we couldn't find the horses. You couldn't see your own boots. You couldn't hear yourself yell. We were going to lose them, and likely ourselves with them if we went out past the rope, and Reuben knew it. And I saw in his face out there in the lantern light that he was about to do it anyway. Go out past the rope into the white nothing after his mares, because that hope was all he had, and a grieving man will throw the last of himself after the last of his hope. And then there was a light coming the other way. It was the boy, Will's. He'd come out God knows how. He must have slipped the rope from the house and come hand over hand along it, and he had a lantern, and he was hauling on the lead rope of the blood-bay gelding, and the gelding was following him, that sour, dangerous horse that wouldn't be led by any grown man on the place, following a thin boy out of the heart of a blizzard like a dog. And behind the gelding, strung along nose to tail in the way horses will, came the mares. Everyone. The boy had gone out into the killing storm after the only horse that loved him. And the horse had brought the whole future of the ranch home behind it. Reuben got to that boy in about 3 strides. He snatched him up off his feet and he held him hard against his chest with the lantern swinging and the snow roaring around the both of them. And over the top of that boy's head in the white wind, I saw Reuben Avery's face break wide open at last. There wasn't any door anymore. There wasn't any holding it shut. He held that boy like the boy was his own, like the boy was the thing he'd lost 2 winters back and got given back, and the tears froze on his face as fast as they came. We got the stock in. We got the boy in. And when we came stumbling into that warm kitchen out of the white death of it, with the mares safe and the boy safe and the whole future of the place safe behind us, Lena Brower came across that kitchen, and she didn't go to the boy first. She went to Reuben. She took his frozen face in her 2 hands and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither one of them said a single word, and they didn't have to, because it was all of it right there on the both of their faces, plain as a brand, the thing they'd both been not saying since September. Then she went to her boy, and Reuben stood there in the middle of his warm lit house with the snow melting off him, looking at the 2 of them, the woman and the child, and I saw him understand that they were his, that they'd been his a good while, that the only person on the whole mesa who hadn't admitted it yet was him. He said it on Christmas Eve. The storm had blown itself out and left the mesa buried and blinding white under a sky scrubbed clean and bitter cold. We dug ourselves out. The mares were fat and safe in the barn. The boy had a bad chest from the storm, and Lena had nursed him through it with mustard plasters and broth and a week of not sleeping, and he'd come out the other side of it the way children do, and that Christmas Eve he was up and well, and there was a goose Lena had got from somewhere and a fire, and the whole house warm and gold. After supper Reuben sent the boy out to the barn with me, on some made-up errand about checking the gelding's water, and the boy and I both knew it was made up. And we went, and we took our time, and we stood in the warm, horse-breathing dark of the barn longer than any water needed checking, because some things a man wants to do without his foreman and a stray boy underfoot. I don't know all of what he said to her in that kitchen. I wasn't there, and it wasn't mine to hear. But Lena told me a piece of it, years on, and I'll tell you the piece she told me, because it was the truest thing I ever heard about the man. He'd stood across the kitchen from her, she said, as far across it as he could get, the way he did, with his hat in his 2 hands though he was in his own house. And he'd said, "I posted for a housekeeper. I want you to know I know what I'm asking now is a different thing, and that you owe me no part of it. You've got your own wage and your own tin and your own road, and if you want to take the boy and go in the spring, you'll go with my team to carry you, and a good word to anybody who asks, and no hard feeling, and that's the truth before God." And then, she said, he'd had to stop and start over twice before he could get the rest of it out. This man who could face down a blizzard but couldn't face 4 words across a warm kitchen. "But I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Not as the help, as my wife if you'll have me, and the boy as my own son, for I'll not have him be anything less. I'm a hard man and a grieving one, and I've not got Ruth's place to offer you, because that's hers and always will be. But there's a place beside it that's been empty 2 winters, and I've got no more sense in keeping it empty. I'm asking you for yourself, free and clear, to answer however you've a mind to. The way and there he stuck again, the way it is when I look at you, I expect you've seen it. Jonah's seen it. The man's no good at hiding what he sees. I'd as soon you saw it too and knew it was honest." And Lena Brower, who'd walked up that mesa with $9 and a trunk and nowhere behind her, and never once asked the man for a single thing, looked at Reuben Avery across his warm kitchen and made the one free choice she'd kept for herself the whole long way. "I've seen it, Reuben," she said. "I've seen it since the killing frost. I just been waiting on you to quit being afraid of it." And she crossed the kitchen that he hadn't been able to cross, and she took his hard face in her 2 hands the way she had the night of the storm, and she said yes. "The boy and I came in from the barn stamping snow and making a deal of noise about it so as to give fair warning, and we found them standing close by the stove, not touching but for his hand around her hand. And the boy looked from one of them to the other with those careful gray eyes of his, reading the weather, and then his thin face split into the first whole easy grin I ever saw on it. "You staying?" he said. "We're staying," Lena told him. And Wills looked up at Reuben Avery, at the gray silent giant of a man who'd said back in September he'd not raise another man's child, and he said, "Then can I keep working Sutter? He's mine now." And Reuben got down on one knee on the cold kitchen floor so he was level with the boy, which I'd never once seen the man do, and he put his big hard hand on that thin shoulder and he said, rough as a rasp and gentle as anything I ever heard, "He's yours, son. They're all yours. Whole place is. You went out in that storm after the future of it and you brought it home, and a man keeps what he saves." And the boy threw his arms around his neck, and Reuben held him. And over the top of the boy's head he looked at Lena, and his eyes did the thing they'd done in the doorway the night of the killing frost. They beamed. That's the only word for it, and I'll not hunt for a better one. The man's whole grieving buried heart came up into his eyes and beamed at her across his warm lit house, and she beamed it right back, and the boy was between them holding on, and that was the family the Avery place got, the winter the widow answered the posting. They married in the Dovetail Church in the spring, when the Mesa Road was open and the colts were dropping fat and sound. The note got paid off the back of that spring's crop of foals. The Blood Bay line Reuben had bet the place on, half of them gentled by a boy who hadn't known a horse from a hole in the ground the September before. The Tilly woman and her crowd came to the wedding and cried like they'd never said a poisoned word in their lives, the way that kind always does. And Lena let them, because she was a bigger woman than they were and she knew it and didn't need to prove it. I gave the bride away, there being nobody else to do it, and I was proud past saying to do it. The boy stood up beside Reuben in a new coat, looking like he'd bust the buttons off it with the swell of him. I worked horses for Reuben Avery another 14 years after that, and I watched that family grow. 2 little ones came along after, a girl and then another boy, and Will's grown tall and turned into the finest hand with a colt I ever trained, better than me by the end, which I'll only admit now that I'm old. The house was never dead again. Ruth's chair stayed in the front room, and Ruth's bonnet stayed on its peg, because Lena would have it so, and there was room in that house for the grieving and the living both, which is a thing I've come to think most houses haven't got the sense to manage. But the thing I remember, the thing I'll carry out of this world with me, is that kitchen doorway the night of the killing frost. A frozen, tired man stopping dead in his own door to look at a warm, lit room he didn't yet believe was meant for him, and his dead gray eyes taking the light and coming alive, and beaming at the woman who'd brought the house back to life without ever once asking him for a thing. He never could say it, that man. Not easy, not ever. But you didn't need him to. You only had to be standing where I was standing and watch the way his eyes beamed when he looked at her to know the whole of it, plain as a brand, true as anything I ever saw on this earth. A man's mouth will lie to spare him. His eyes won't. And Reuben Avery's eyes told me the truth of that man a full season before he found the nerve to say it out loud, and they went on telling it every supper, every Christmas, every ordinary golden evening for the rest of his good long life.